seems like every day there's something new happening with digital asset regulation. You know, new proposals, challenges to what's already there. It's hard to keep up. So today we're going to do a deep dive into one very specific example of this whole regulatory back and forth.
Yeah, it's definitely a dynamic landscape.
Specifically, Congress is pushing back against the IRS and their regulations on digital asset brokers.
Right. We're seeing some pretty serious attempts to, change how things are done.
Yeah. And you're probably familiar with the fact that the IRS has issued these new rules that try to define who's a broker when it comes to digital assets and what kind of reporting they need to do. But now you have Congress stepping in with this thing called HJ Res 25.
Right. This resolution is aiming to completely block those IRS rules.
Make them unenforceable, basically. So we're going to take a deep dive today to understand this whole fight. We want to know what's making Congress try to block the IRS like this. What do these broker rules actually say about digital assets? And this is the most important part, especially for anyone following DeFi. What are the potential real-world consequences? What's going to happen because of all this?
Yeah, it's important to look at the bigger picture.
And to do this, we're going to be looking at the actual text of HA Res 25. We've also got the final regulations from the IRS, plus some other extra explanations whether responding to concerns from the industry.
Okay, sounds like we've got a lot to cover.
So let's get started.
Let's dive in.
Why don't we start with the heart of these IRS regulations? Their definition of a broker within DeFi, decentralized finance. That seems to be the thing everyone's talking about. And the IRS has been really specific. They're mainly focused on trading front-end service providers.
Yeah, they're drawing a clear line there.
So if we're talking about a trading front-end service, what does that actually look like in the real world? The websites or apps you use to interact with DeFi.
Right.
The IRS defines these as services that take your order to sell some kind of digital asset and then get it ready to be executed. That includes the user interface, so the part you see and click on where you put in all your trade details, and also the part that sends those details to the underlying distributed ledger.
So basically the whole process of getting your trade from your screen to the blockchain.
Exactly. And get this, it even includes sending the order to your own digital wallet for execution. That part's interesting.
Yeah, that's a pretty wide scope.
Now, here's what's kind of fascinating. The IRS is saying, generally, they're not classifying the people who run the DeFi protocols themselves as brokers. So that means decentralized autonomous organizations, the DAOs, and even people who hold governance tokens in those protocols. They're not brokers, according to the IRS.
They're making a pretty big distinction there.
And they've given a few reasons for this. First, there often isn't a direct customer relationship, like the kind we're used to. These protocols are basically lines of code on a blockchain.
Right. It's not like you're calling up customer service for a DeFi protocol.
Then it can be super hard to figure out who's actually in charge, especially with DAOs, which are decentralized by design. And a lot of this code is immutable, which means you can't just go back and change it to fit new reporting rules.
So even if they wanted to, it's not like they can just tweak the code to comply.
Right. So as we were saying before, their focus is on those trading front ends.
The interfaces, the gateways to the protocol.
Now, this is where things get a little, debatable. The IRS is comparing these DeFi trading apps to stock exchanges, which, aren't usually called brokers themselves. But they do say there's one big difference. DeFi protocols are generally open to anyone. It's not like traditional exchanges with all their restrictions on who can participate. But even with that difference, the IRS is saying these trading front ends, they're the best place to put these reporting rules because they have that direct interaction with the customer. Plus, their software can usually be changed, updated to follow the rules.
Yeah, they're highlighting the practicalities of enforcement there.
However, and this is important, the IRS has said straight up that they will reconsider if they start seeing a lot of digital asset trading that's bypassing these front-end reporting systems. Like if everyone's trading directly with the protocols instead, they're basically saying they're watching how this all evolves and they might change their approach.
So it's not like this is set in stone. They're open to adapting.
Now, there's been some pushback, obviously. Some people are saying just providing software shouldn't be the same as effectuating transfers. They're comparing it to, internet service providers or even search engines tools that help you access things but don't actually carry out the transaction. What did the IRS say about that argument?
Well, the IRS didn't buy that analogy at all. They're very firm on that. They say these trading front ends aren't just passively passing along information. They see them as a key part of the transaction itself. These platforms are what let users make their trade orders, confirm them, and send them out in a way that the blockchain can understand and execute. They're comparing it to the electronic systems that traditional brokers use to route orders.
So they're saying even though it's technology doing the work, it's still part of the brokering process.
Exactly. The technology is a tool, but the provider of that tool is still considered a broker in their eyes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the argument that to effectuate a transfer, you need to have control of the private keys? That's a pretty big deal in the crypto world.
Yeah, that's a core concept. But that's another point where the IRS disagrees. They don't think effectuate means you have to be holding the private keys. They point to the existing rules for securities, where you have brokers who never actually take custody of their clients' assets, but they're still considered brokers under Section 6045 of the tax code. The IRS is saying, if you provide the way for the transaction to happen, that's enough, even if you're not holding the keys yourself.
So in their view, facilitating the transaction is the key factor, regardless of who holds the private key.
Exactly. It's about enabling the transfer to take place.
Okay, so now we've got a clearer picture of these IRS regulations and who they're targeting. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about why some members of Congress are trying to block these rules. What's the motivation behind HJRes 25? What are they worried about?
There are several big concerns they're raising, and these touch on some really fundamental aspects of the DeFi ecosystem. One of the biggest worries is what these regulations could do to innovation and development in the U.S. DeFi sector.
Yeah, some are saying these regulations and the uncertainty they create about what future regulations might look like could have a real chilling effect. Like it could discourage people from investing and make the U.S. a less appealing place to build and run DeFi platforms.
Right. If developers and entrepreneurs feel like the regulatory landscape is too unpredictable, they might just go somewhere else where it's more stable.
Exactly. And then there's the resources issue. All the work that these trading front-end providers would have to do to comply, things like setting up KYC, AML systems that takes a lot of money and attention, resources that could be going towards developing new technology.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. Spending time and money on compliance means less time and money for building new things.
The worry is that the U.S. could fall behind in this fast-moving space and end up pushing innovation offshore, basically sending it to other countries.
And that would be a loss for the U.S. DeFi industry.
Another big point of contention is how enforceable these rules really are and the huge burden they put on companies to comply. We're talking about an industry that's kind of built on pseudonymity, and now these front ends are potentially on the hook for KYC, AML, and tracking transactions.
That's a tough ask, especially when you consider how DeFi transactions often work.
Right. It's not always easy to identify users in the same way you would in traditional finance.
And even the IRS admits that these regulations are going to create a lot of work and cost a lot of money for these trading front ends. They've actually estimated that just getting set up to comply could take each broker between 1,800 and 3,600 hours. That's a massive amount of work.
Wow, that's a lot of time and resources.
Yeah, it's a serious undertaking. And Congress might be looking at those numbers and thinking, is this even realistic?
Yeah.
Especially for smaller companies, startups, Could this lead to uneven enforcement where some companies can comply and others can't?
And then there's the question of whether some companies will just say, forget it, it's too expensive and complicated, and they'll just leave the U.S. market entirely.
That's a real possibility. The cost of doing business might just be too high.
Now, the IRS did push back the applicability date to January 1st, 2027, and they offered some transitional relief, which shows they know this is a big deal. But as HJRes 25 shows us, some in Congress think those measures don't go nearly far enough.
Right. They're still pushing for a complete overturn of the regulations.
And then we have to talk about the concerns about user privacy and the whole idea of decentralization, which is so central to DeFi. If you start requiring KYC and AML at the trading front-end level, you're inevitably going to reduce anonymity and privacy for users.
Yeah, that's a core issue. People are drawn to DeFi for the privacy it offers, and these regulations could chip away at that.
And this could scare away people who like DeFi precisely because of those features.
Right. It's a potential deterrent for a lot of users.
Now, the IRS's response to this is that traditional brokers have been handling sensitive personal information securely for years. They're saying it's doable. But like you said earlier, the whole point of DeFi is often to minimize how much data is collected and give users more control. So even if it's technically possible, a lot of people in DeFi, including policymakers, have some fundamental issues with extending these KYC and AML requirements into this space.
It really challenges the underlying principles of DeFi for a lot of people.
Right, so we've talked about the practicality of it all, the potential costs and impact on innovation, and the privacy concerns. Now, let's talk about something a little different. The IRS's legal authority to actually implement these rules in this way. There are some questions about whether they're overstepping their boundaries.
Right, that's a key point of contention.
The Treasury and the IRS are saying that a specific section of the tax code section 6045C1D, which was amended by the Infrastructure Act, gives them the clear legal right to treat certain DeFi participants as brokers, specifically those who provide services that effectuate transfers of digital assets.
So they're grounding their authority in the language of the law.
And their argument is that the existing definition of a broker was already pretty broad, and those changes from the Infrastructure Act were meant to specifically address the unique aspects of digital assets. So they're interpreting effectuating services to include these trading front ends, seeing them as crucial parts of making DeFi transactions happen.
They're saying without these front-end services, the transactions wouldn't be possible in the same way.
Exactly. And they're also pushing back against the idea that this section of the tax code only applies to entities that already fit the definition of a broker before those amendments, or that it only applies to agents. They're pointing out that the law uses the term service providers, which they see as a much broader category.
So they're arguing for a wider interpretation of the law.
Right. And like we discussed before, they're also rejecting the idea that effectuate has to mean controlling private keys. They're using examples from the securities industry to back that up.
So they're saying, look, this is how it works in other parts of finance. It should apply to digital assets as well.
Okay, so we've got this fundamental disagreement about how to interpret the law and how much power the IRS has in this area. Now let's bring it back to the people actually working in the industry. What are the real-world effects of these regulations for our listeners who are involved in DeFi? What should they be aware of?
Well, the industry has a lot of concerns, and they're not shying away from voicing them. The most immediate issue is the increased compliance burden and the costs that come with it for those trading front ends that will now be classified as brokers. It's not just about setting everything up initially. It's about the ongoing investment in KYC/ML procedures, making sure they can track transactions properly, and building the infrastructure for all the reporting they'll have to do. And the IRS has estimated that this will cost each broker, on average, about 425 hours per year and about $27,000 in ongoing costs.
That's a pretty significant chunk of change, especially for smaller companies and startups in DeFi.
Yeah, it's a real financial burden. And as we mentioned before, the fact that a lot of DeFi transactions are pseudonymous makes it even harder to collect the data they need for compliance and raises a lot of privacy concerns around unhosted wallets and pseudonymous addresses. It's a tricky situation.
It definitely adds a whole layer of complexity.
There's also the worry that this will create an uneven playing field. Some providers who decide to go all in on compliance might find themselves at a disadvantage compared to those who don't, or those who are operating outside of the US. This could push users towards platforms that are less compliant or based in other countries, which could ironically hurt the IRS's goal of getting more people to comply with tax rules in the US.
It's almost like it could backfire on them.
And then there's the whole issue of innovation that we talked about earlier. If companies are spending more time and money trying to figure out all these regulations, they might have less capacity to develop new and innovative DeFi applications.
There's a resource allocation problem.
Exactly. And it's not just the providers who will feel the impact. DeFi users could be affected too.
How so?
Well, all these increased compliance costs for the front ends could eventually get passed down to the users in the form of higher fees. And that kind of defeats one of the big advantages of DeFi, which is lower transaction costs compared to traditional finance. Plus, like we said, there's the issue of reduced anonymity, which is a big draw for many DeFi users.
It's kind of a double whammy for users, potentially higher costs and less privacy.
Exactly. It's a trade-off that many users might not be happy about.
And all of this could actually end up favoring the more centralized players in the industry, the ones who are already better equipped to handle these compliance burdens. This could shift the DeFi landscape away from its decentralized roots.
It's a potential unintended consequence that could have a big impact on the shape of the industry.
The IRS has tried to soften the blow a bit by delaying the applicability date and offering some transitional relief, like pushing back the effective date for backup withholding to January 1st, 2028. They're giving the industry some time to adjust. But it's really important to remember that they specifically considered and rejected the idea of making exceptions or delays for small businesses. They argued that this was necessary to make sure the regulations are effective in closing the tax gap and making things fair across the whole industry.
So they're trying to balance the need for compliance with the realities of the industry, but it's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. Okay, so we've got a good handle on what the IRS rules are and why Congress might be unhappy with them. Let's talk about the actual tool they're using to try to block these rules. The Congressional Review Act, or SCRA, that's what HJRE's 25 is based on, right?
That's right. HJRS 25 is using the CRA, which is a way for Congress to review and potentially overturn certain rules made by agencies like the IRS. It has to happen within a certain time frame after the rules are finalized, though. And the fact that Congress is even considering this shows how much concern there is about these IRS regulations. It's a pretty powerful tool because Congress can overturn these rules with a simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate, as long as they do it within a specific time frame.
So it's not something they take lightly.
Right. The introduction of this resolution is a serious challenge to the IRS's authority in this area. It shows that Congress is willing to step in and potentially overrule the agency.
It definitely highlights how important this whole issue is and the ongoing debate about how to regulate digital assets. So, to wrap things up, what's the main conflict here? What are the two sides battling over?
The core tension is between Congress, or at least a significant portion of it, who are pushing back against these IRS regulations, and the IRS itself, which is saying these rules are necessary. Congress is worried about the potential negative effects on innovation, especially in the U.S. They're also concerned about how difficult and costly it will be to actually enforce these rules and for companies to comply with them. And then there are the worries about user privacy and whether the IRS is overstepping its legal boundaries.
So Congress is coming at it from a few different angles.
Right. They're looking at the practical implications, the potential costs, and the legal basis for these regulations. And on the other side, the IRS is saying, look, we have the legal authority to do this, and these rules are absolutely necessary to address the tax gap in the digital asset space. They're pointing to similar reporting frameworks in traditional finance as a justification.
They're basically saying this is how it's always been done, and digital assets shouldn't be an exception.
Exactly. They see this as a matter of fairness and ensuring that everyone pays their fair share.
So we have this really interesting situation. Rapid technological change in DeFi, strong opinions on both sides, and a lot of uncertainty about the future. It really makes you think, what's the right balance between regulation and the core principles of decentralization and innovation in the digital asset space? How do we make sure we're not stifling innovation while also ensuring responsible behavior?
It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. And what does all this back and forth between Congress and the IRS tell us about the future of financial regulation in a world that's becoming increasingly reliant on technology? What will the rules of the road look like in this new landscape?
Those are some really important questions to think about as we navigate this whole evolving landscape.
This deep dive has definitely uncovered a complex situation that's still unfolding.
This is definitely not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. So we encourage you to keep learning and stay informed about what's happening in this space because it's going to keep changing and it affects all of us.
Absolutely. Staying informed is key.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.